Before I get into the sermon, I just want to take a minute to acknowledge how blessed I feel to have been asked to give the sermon today. If anyone had asked me a year ago if this is something I might be doing in a year's time, I'd say this couldn't be further from what I thought I would be doing. A year ago, my mother passed away from COVID. And I tell you this because the sequence of events that have taken place in my life since then, I think, is why I'm even able to be standing up here today. Some of you may know by now that this is what I have wanted to do since I was 12 years old, so when I say that this is a blessing for me, I truly mean it. In today's lesson, we are in Luke 16, where we hear the parable about the dishonest steward. As most of you probably know, a parable is designed to hide the truth of the story to the non-believers. Conversely, for those who are seeking Jesus, the message will be revealed to them through the parable if their hearts are open to receiving the message. This particular parable was addressed to the sons of light, those who seek God's word. We know that in the previous parables, the lost sheep, the lost coin, and the lost son, those parables were spoken to a crowd of a variety of people. This parable was specifically meant for Jesus' disciples. Why is that important, though? Well, Jesus tells a parable in order to help the listener better understand a heavenly message. So, he takes an earthly concept that's easier to grasp so that the real message may be understood. So perhaps Jesus felt there was something in this parable his disciples stood to gain from hearing it, something they may have been wrestling with in themselves. This story was meant for his disciples. It was meant for us to hear. In this story, we have a dishonest steward, and he is about to lose his job because it turns out that he's been mismanaging his manager's money. Now, back then, a steward was someone who would be employed by a rich person to manage their possessions, their land, and their resources, all their assets, and they would be responsible for collecting all their debts. And this particular steward had been squandering his master's possessions, and now the manager has decided to fire his steward, but not before he asks the steward to give a record of all of the accounts. Upon hearing that he is to be fired, the steward's wheels start turning. He's about to lose everything, his financial security, his home, his reputation. So he says to himself, I know I'm not strong enough to dig ditches, and I'm too proud to beg. He has to think pretty quickly about how he can secure his future. He decides that he's going to go to all the people who owe his manager a debt, and he's going to reduce those debts for them. Then we read that his manager, upon hearing about this, is not mad, but actually commends him for his shrewd tactics. Nowhere do we read that the steward tells the farmers that he's about to be fired, or that the farmers even question why their debts are being reduced. I mean, of course, this is a deal of a lifetime. Where do I sign? If somebody came to me and told me that they were going to wipe off half of my car loan, I don't think I'd also be asking a lot of questions. This is a huge amount of debt being taken off. But why did the steward do this? He does this so that when he is fired, these people may show him compassion and hospitality. He doesn't just do this with one person. He does this with several people. So when the time came that he would need housing or a meal or a job, there would be this sort of peer pressure amongst the farmers to oblige the steward. We're talking about people who lived in an honor society. They weren't going to turn him away after he just helped them in such a huge way. We then hear Jesus say to his disciples, and I tell you, make friends for yourselves by means of dishonest wealth, so that when it is gone, they may welcome you into the eternal homes. Wait a minute. Jesus is telling us to behave like the shrewd steward? I admit I had to read through this a few times to figure out what was going on. And yes, he is saying this, but why? This parable really challenged me. And when my wheels began to turn, I finally made a connection. This story is about relationships. Relationship to money, relationship to one another, and our relationship to God. All of these parables in this section of Luke seem to have a common theme. They're about God's priority to our relationship with each of us over everything else, and that he wants that for each of us, with each other, and with him. He's telling his disciples, these children of light, to behave more shrewdly with dishonest wealth like the children of this age do. I'm pretty sure God knows how the world works. He knows that an exchange has to take place for the transfer of goods and resources amongst one another. And we're all a part of it, and it's a corrupt and unrighteous system that existed within society back then and today. One that tells us we need that fancy car and big house and the latest gadget. These ideas that enter our minds and hearts and distract us and distance us from one another and from God. Now, I'm not saying that we can't enjoy nice things, that we can't have comforts in life, and I don't believe that's the message from God here either. I'm saying that we shouldn't obtain these things at the expense of relationship and genuine connection to one another, or allow it to hinder our ability to hear God's message of his unconditional love for us. Jesus then wraps up the story saying, "You cannot serve two masters. You cannot serve God and wealth. You either hate money and love God, or you love money and hate God." Jesus is saying, take from this unrighteous system and do good things with it. Make friends with it. Invest in people over earthly possessions. Make relationships a priority over money and material possessions. Because when the system fails, and it will, none of these things will matter. Every cent we have will be left here. We will leave this world as naked as we entered it, and someone else will have to figure out what to do with all of the things we left behind. In Matthew chapter 6, one of the statements from the Sermon on the Mount, we hear Jesus say, "Do not store up for yourself treasures on earth where moths and rust destroy, and thieves break in and steal, but store up for yourselves treasures in heaven." Those treasures, the ones that connect us to the promise of God's love for us, our joy, our brokenness, our relationships and experiences with each other, that is where we experience God's love, and that is what we can take with us. When my mother passed away last year, she left behind all of her possessions, as one does, and it was incredibly difficult to go through her items and decide what should stay and what should go. I had to tell myself over and over, just let them go. They're just things. Keeping them won't make her being gone any easier or miss her any less. I miss her. I miss having moments with her, the good ones and the bad ones, especially the bad ones in my opinion. Because when we share our pain, our brokenness, when we allow ourselves to be vulnerable with one another, that is what brings us closer to each other, and that is where God finds us. When we share these very real human experiences, we begin to understand each other, and when we understand, we can accept, and when we accept, we can find peace. Those moments, those are the treasures to store up. It is also in those moments where we can truly feel love not because of, but in spite of who we are. A truth I've been needing to be reminded of a lot as of lately, and I'm sure the ones telling me are hoping the message will sink in eventually. Accepting our brokenness as a gift is challenging, but it is a gift. We all don't get there at the same time though, do we? I am just now beginning to learn this about myself. By sharing my own brokenness with others, I found my way back to relationships, I found my way to this community, and I found my way back to God, all of which I thought I had lost. No, it is not our wealth or possessions that will greet us at our eternal homes. It's the ones we loved and whom have loved us. It is the ones who befriended us and whom we have befriended. And isn't this our life in Jesus together? God has always favored relationship with us. When we are far off, when we are in need, when we feel lost, God favors loving us and knowing us and being with us. God puts relationships over everything else. And like in our story today, we too are stewards of God's gifts, and we are being called to not squander these gifts